The only evidence that America spent its own money holding up Japan's economy is a photograph of a handwritten to-do list. It was sitting in front of the Secretary of the Treasury of the United States, with one line on it legible from across the room: buy Japanese yen, $5 to $10 billion. The photo was taken at 11:33 in the morning on July 31st by a photographer with a long lens sitting across the room. That Friday, for the first time since 1998, the United States walked into the currency market and bought yen, and the receipt was a doodle on a notepad. What makes this interesting is the rate America pays to borrow money for 30 years also just hit the highest level on record since July of 2007, and the country we're helping prop up holds more American government debt than anyone else on Earth. So the question becomes, why are we doing this? What are we actually buying? Here's President Trump on Air Force One explaining it.
Mr. President, why is the U.S. intervening to support the Japan yen at this time?
To support who?
To support the Japanese currency.
Because we have a good relationship with Japan. We're very strong, very, very strong financially. And they have a weakening yen, and they wanted a little bit of help. And we're always there for Japan. Japan's been very good to us, with the exception, of course, of Pearl Harbor.
Friendship, financial strength, and Pearl Harbor, all covered in one conversation. If that isn't the most Trump thing you've heard, then I don't know what is. Tokyo got asked the same question and answered in stiffer language. Japan's finance minister confirmed the action was taken in accordance with the United States Treasury, and that it countered excessive volatility and disorderly movements in the Japanese yen. Translated out of Treasury speak, the yen was falling, Japan was hurting, and America had to step in and play daddy to make the pain stop. Which raises another question. Where does a government get the money to buy a foreign currency on a Friday afternoon? The answer is a pot of money at the Treasury called the Exchange Stabilization Fund. The Secretary of the Treasury can spend it without asking Congress. He just needs the president's signature, and the credit card opens up. It was created with one goal, it's in the name, to stabilize the exchange value of the dollar. But throughout history, that's not what it tends to get used for. The word stabilize wasn't as clearly defined as it should have been, so the Exchange Stabilization Fund tends to get spent on whatever the Secretary decides. Like when the 60th U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, David Kennedy, reportedly drew on the fund to buy an Oriental carpet for $8,000. Or when the 63rd Secretary of the Treasury, William Simon, took a trip to London, Moscow, and Mexico City with 42 people on it. That cost $131,000 and had no official purpose anyone could identify, once again, paid for by the Exchange Stabilization Fund. You can think of it as the Secretary of the Treasury and President's personal piggy bank. The Secretary can spend without asking Congress. He just needs the President's signature and nothing else. The statute also says his decisions are final and, I'm quoting, may not be reviewed by another officer or employee of the government. But the part that matters with the Exchange Stabilization Fund is what was sitting inside it. Because America did not buy those yen with dollars. It sold euros. Roughly $13 billion of that fund is held in euro assets, and that's what went out the door. America sold Europe's currency to buy Japan's, and the European Central Bank only found out after the trades had cleared. Senior European officials told the Financial Times this broke decades of convention, and that it had never happened before. The Treasury's answer, when they were asked, was that it doesn't coordinate with anyone on how it allocates that fund. Which is true, but is also basically the same as saying you plead the fifth. And there's one more thing in this timeline that's important. On July 23rd, the U.S. Treasury's Foreign Exchange Monitoring List was published. It's the official government watch list to track major U.S. trading partners and ensure they aren't artificially manipulating their currencies. On the list are countries like China, Germany, Korea, and most importantly, Japan. 8 days later, the same building that released this report bought Japan's currency. So America broke a 28-year rule, paid by dumping Europe's currency, only told them after the trade was done, and all for a country it had listed as a currency risk the week before. Why? Well, a while back, I made a video about how one of the main threats to the United States economy was Japan quietly stepping back from the American bond market. That's the reason. To understand why Japan is so important to us, you have to know what Japan would have had to do if America hadn't shown up to save the day. Japan owes more relative to the size of its economy than any major country on Earth. This year, the cost of servicing that debt jumped nearly 11% to 13 trillion yen, out of a total budget of 122.3 trillion yen. And right as Japan's debt bill is spiraling, the yen has also collapsed to 40-year lows. Why the currency is falling isn't complicated. It comes down to basic math. For the last few decades, Japan kept its borrowing cost pinned near zero. Whether this was a good idea or not is up to interpretation, but they've recently started rolling it all back. Japan's benchmark rate now sits around 1%, while America's sits between 3.5% and 3.75%. That gap is the entire story, because capital doesn't catch feelings. It's not your clingy ex-girlfriend. Capital goes wherever it gets paid the most. So investors dump the yen, chase the higher yield in dollars, and drive the currency off a cliff. Which is usually where the armchair economists show up and ask, why doesn't Japan just raise interest rates and close the gap? Problem solved, and it's because they can't. They're trapped by a financial monster of their own creation. To hold borrowing costs at zero for that long, the Bank of Japan had to buy its own government's bonds, trillions of yen of them, year after year, until it owned about half of the entire Japanese government bond market. It's a country that solved its debt problem by buying its own debt. And those bonds pay almost nothing, because paying nothing was the entire point. But the cash commercial banks park at the Bank of Japan get paid whatever the central bank's rate is. So the moment the Bank of Japan raises rates to close the gap and save the yen, it starts paying out trillions of yen in interest, while still collecting almost nothing on the pile it's stuck holding. You don't need to have a degree in central banking to know that's a horrible deal. So Japan can now either defend the yen or it can afford the debt. It can't do both, which has left Japan exactly one way to defend its own currency. Currencies trade in pairs. If you want one to go up, you buy it and sell the other one. And because the US dollar sits on one side of nearly 90% of all currency trades on Earth, buying yen almost always means selling dollars. The good news for Japan, it has the dollars. Japan is the largest foreign holder of American government debt. More than the United Kingdom, more than China, more than anyone else on the planet. The bad news, most of those dollars aren't sitting in a checking account. But before I get into that, a quick pause. If you're a longtime viewer of my channel, you know I love data. And that's because without it, you're basically just guessing and calling it analysis. The good news is, disclosure rules and regulators make most of the data you need publicly available. The bad news is, it's usually scattered across hundreds of sources that all have websites that look like they were built in the 80s. Which brings us to the sponsor of today's video, OxyLabs, which you can find at oxylabs.io/casualfinance. OxyLabs is a web intelligence and data infrastructure platform. With their Oxy Copilot feature and Web Scraper API, they do the data collecting for you. You can get real-time data from Google search results, e-commerce listings, or almost any public website. With 175 million plus residential proxies in 195 countries, OxyLabs provides one of the largest proxy networks in the world. There's no browser setup, servers, or proxy management needed, meaning you can start collecting data without having to build the infrastructure. If you're interested, you can go to oxylabs.io/casualfinance for a free trial of OxyLabs with up to 2,000 web scraping results for free. No credit card is required. You can use my code, CASUALFINANCE, for 20% off all OxyLabs plans. Thank you to OxyLabs for sponsoring this video. Now back to how the Japanese economy is royally f***ed. Of Japan's roughly $1.3 trillion in reserves, about $930 billion sit in securities. Most of that is in American government bonds, and a bond is not money. You can't hand a Treasury bond to a currency dealer and ask for change. So there's two things Japan can do with its war chest of American bonds. It can sell them, or it can pawn them. Japan's choice was to start selling. Across 1 month, Japan mounted the largest currency defense in its history, 11.7 trillion yen, or nearly $74 billion spent in 4 weeks holding up its own money, and that money came from selling down its American bond holdings. In May, Japan's holdings of American government debt fell by $66.7 billion, the single largest one-month drop in Treasury holdings by any country in recorded history. Japan needed dollars, and Japan sold American paper to get them, and it worked. For about 3 weeks. Then reality set in. A bond's price and the interest rate on it move in opposite directions. Flood the market with American bonds nobody asked for, the price drops, and the government that issued them has to pay more to borrow. So Japan sells American debt. American borrowing costs go up. The gap between the two countries gets wider, and capital still goes wherever it gets paid the most, so it goes to America. Every dollar Tokyo raised to push the yen up made the reason the yen was falling in the first place slightly worse. This is what's known as the FX intervention feedback loop, or the doom loop. It's a machine that eats its own tail. Every force pushing the yen down before the operation was still pushing it down after. The rate gap was still 250 to 275 basis points. The Bank of Japan still owned half of its own bond market. The yen was still near 40-year lows. Japan spent a record amount of money, sold American debt to do it, and told the entire world it meant business. And not only did Japan's way not work, it also was now America's problem. America's long-term borrowing costs are at their highest level since 2007, and America's single largest foreign lender had just demonstrated in public that when its currency gets in trouble, it's willing to become a seller, which is a thing you'd rather your biggest lender not do. So that meant somebody had to build a second way, and somebody did. There's a tool at the Federal Reserve where a foreign government can hand over its American bonds, take dollars in exchange, and buy the bonds back later at a slightly higher repurchase price. It's a pawn shop for governments. The official name for it is the Foreign and International Monetary Authority's repo facility. These are liquidity tools for central banks that run on short-term repurchase agreements. Here's how it works. A foreign central bank, like the Bank of Japan, hands over $100 in U.S. bonds to the Federal Reserve. In return, the Fed gives them $100 in cash. Then the next day, the Bank of Japan buys those bonds back for $101. That $1 difference between the sale price and the repurchase price is the interest earned by the Federal Reserve. The whole reason for the facility is to give foreign countries quick access to dollars, so they aren't forced to dump American debt onto the open market. It gives Japan a way to raise dollars without ever becoming a seller. It's what you build for a creditor you cannot afford to lose. Which brings us back to July 31st, the day when the U.S. Department of the Treasury and Japan's Ministry of Finance executed a joint market operation to prop up the rapidly depreciating Japanese yen. Because 48 hours after the operation, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent took to Twitter to say that the FIMA repo facility is an important backstop and that he'd encourage the Fed to expand it in the coming months. But here's the detail that makes the request strange: nobody was using it. The facility has a ceiling of $60 billion per country, and the balance was sitting at zero. Days after he asked, Bloomberg reported it had gone unused for an 8th straight week. So he wasn't asking for more room because he'd run out. Nobody was anywhere near the ceiling. He was asking the central bank, in public, 48 hours after a currency operation, to build capacity for something that hadn't happened yet. Then he went on CNBC, where the host laid it out pretty straightforward. Because one thing we definitely don't want is Japan selling treasuries to do this, so you have encouraged the Federal Reserve to upsize. Bessent responded, saying the goal was to protect the U.S. economy and keep any volatility offshore, and that the FEMA facility was done in 2020, and the size of the bond market was much smaller then. So I think it would be reasonable for the Fed to consider upsizing the facility. Which is an answer to a different question. He did the thing every official is trained to do, redirect the question, because he conveniently didn't mention that the facility was sitting unused, or that its ceiling is $60 billion per country, while Japan spent $73 billion defending the yen in 1 month alone. He pointed at the bond market instead. It was smaller in 2020, he said, so it would be reasonable for the Fed to consider upsizing, which is true, but it's also not what was asked. You don't publicly ask the central bank to make an empty facility bigger unless you know something is coming. Now, maybe that's just my read. Maybe I'm connecting dots that aren't connected. Except, I'm not the only one connecting them. Mark Sobel, a guy who looks like he knows his way around an economics textbook, and who also spent about 4 decades inside the U.S. Treasury working on international monetary policy, wrote that, aside from supporting a friend, the Treasury may have been concerned that a weak yen could push American long-term rates higher. So the president says friendship, the Treasury Secretary says stability, and the man who spent nearly 40 years inside the Treasury says there's more to this story. It looks like a story where the country holding more American debt than anyone else on the planet demonstrates, in public, that it will sell that debt to fund its own currency defense, which becomes a supply problem in a market that is at a 19-year high. The funny thing about all this is that none of it's hidden. Everything I've covered is public. A data release, a tweet, a blog post, a photograph. The catch is, you just have to dig deeper, because the story that gets reported and the story that's actually unfolding underneath are rarely the same one, which is where I come in. I made this channel because I like doing the dirty work. I read the boring documents so you don't have to, and then I tell you what's buried in them. If that's worth something to you, hit subscribe. Of everything in this story, the only thing that told you exactly what was happening, with nothing hidden beneath the surface, was a handwritten to-do list that nobody was ever supposed to see.